Guess what is actually happening now, ladies and gentlemen? Russian President Vladimir Putin has made a significant announcement about military cooperation with African states or nations, speaking during a meeting of the Commission for Military Technical Cooperation with Foreign States or Countries. He revealed or he exposed that African partners are ready to expand ties with Russia despite Western opposition.
New prospects are opening up for deepening military technical cooperation with countries in other regions of the planet, including the states of the African continent. We genuinely value our historically robust, friendly, and truly trusting relationships with all the nations of Africa. Over the years, both the USSR and then Russia supplied African nations with significant arms and military gear, trained specialists for their production, operation, repair, as well as military personnel. Today, despite Western pressure, African partners are ready to expand military and military technical ties with Russia. This concerns not only increasing supplies of Russian military exports, but also the procurement of other armaments, other materials and products, taking into account comprehensive servicing of previously supplied equipment.
Today, the world is watching as Africa takes a bold step, ladies and gentlemen. Leaders are ready to deepen ties with Russia even as pressure rises from the West. Decisions made new could actually reshape the continent's future, ladies and gentlemen. Security, peace, and of course, power hang in the balance. Every move carries weight that will actually last for years. This cooperation, ladies and gentlemen, is not actually with new. Russia and of course, earlier the Soviets with has a long history of military partnerships in Africa. They have supplied weapons, trained soldiers, and of course, taught experts, how to maintain military equipment. Putin emphasized that these relations, ladies and gentlemen, are growing stronger now. Even under external pressure, Africa's interest in Russian military support is about more than weapons, ladies and gentlemen. Leaders want to strengthen the national security and of course gain or get reliable partners. Putin's promise, ladies and gentlemen, shows that Russia is willing to meet this demand with modern equipment and of course technical expertise. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, global tensions rise in Ukraine. Russian security concerns remain central to Moscow's decisions. Experts like Matonzi, a political analyst from South Africa, ladies and gentlemen, say that peace talks will only succeed if core security needs are addressed. He warns that proposals like referendums in Donbass are seen as unrealistic given ongoing security risk, ladies and gentlemen. Matonzi explains that, ladies and gentlemen, Russia has been serious in negotiations, sending top intelligence officials signals, commitment, past agreements from Minsk to Abu Dhabi, often failed because promises were actually broken. This history has made Russia firmed. Certain territories like Donbass, ladies and gentlemen, are non-negotiable, and of course, Ukrainian forces must actually withdraw. The connection between Africa and of course Russia is a key point, ladies and gentlemen, in this global puzzle. Whilst the West pushes for certain outcomes or results, African nations or states are making independence choices. Putin's commitment could actually open new pathways for stability and of course cooperation across the continent of Africa, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is the moral lesson here, or the moral insight here. Leadership decisions today can actually affect the lives of millions, ladies and gentlemen. Strong partnerships must actually balance ambition with responsibility or duty. Africa's path shows the value of careful planning and of course courage in facing external pressures. Russian military history with Africa spans decades, ladies and gentlemen. From the Soviet era or time, many African states or countries received weapons, technical training, and of course military advisors. Putin stressed that these long-standing ties are now evolving or developing to meet modern security challenges, ladies and gentlemen. The agreement goes beyond simple arms sales. African states or nations can now access Russian expertise, technology, and of course equipment. This actually allows them to strengthen national defense and of course create self-reliance, ladies and gentlemen. Putin highlighted that cooperation is mutual, ladies and gentlemen. Russia gains strategic partners and Africa gains security stability. The West has expressed concern over growing Russia-Africa ties, ladies and gentlemen. However, African leaders insist that these decisions are their own. Yes, they prioritize national interest, security, and of course development over external opinions. This reflects a principle seen throughout history, ladies and gentlemen. Nations must act in their people's best interest, even when facing pressure. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, ladies and gentlemen, Russia faces a tense situation in Ukraine. Analysts like Matonzi argue that any peace deal must address Russia's core security needs. He points out that the US and EU often disrupt or interrupt negotiations. Past agreements failed because one side did not actually honor or respect commitment.
Remember, the military-industrial complex want him to fight so they can supply him with weapons, they can push loans. The longer the war takes, it's a benefit. He also wants to stay in this war because one, he does not want to have a situation whereby the elections will have to come tomorrow. Once we have elections tomorrow, that means he's out of the office because even Ukrainians themselves, they want nothing to do with him. Him and his cronies, they've taken a lot of money from EU, from US, and from other parts of the world, from the countries that will sympathize with them, mostly US, UK, France, or let's say EU. And they overlook the corruption things that they do there. So the EU is likely to advise him. Is likely to advise him to continue fighting, because the longer you owe the banking families and the military-industrial complex, it's the bigger the chunk of Ukraine they're going to take and control. Because the idea is to be at the borders with Russia. Hence, the dream of breaking Russia apart has not stopped.
Motonzi warns that unless key demands are met, ladies and gentlemen, conflicts will actually continue. Crimea and of course Donbass are central to Moscow's strategy. Any compromise that ignores the security concerns will actually not hold. He emphasized that political pressure alone cannot achieve lasting peace, ladies and gentlemen. This situation reveals or exposes a long lesson about global relations. Peace is sustainable only when security and of course trust are respected or honored. Agreement must be fair, ladies and gentlemen, and nations or states must follow through. Africa's choice to work with Russia, ladies and gentlemen, reflects the principle building partnerships based on mutual respect and of course reliability. Putin's announcement is not just about weapons. It signals a long-term vision. Africa's growing role in international security demonstrates or shows the importance of independence decision was making. Leaders must balance the diplomacy, defense, and of course development carefully. Russia's stance or position in Ukraine has global impact, ladies and gentlemen. Motonzi points out that Washington and of course Kiev sometimes disrupt peace talks. Russia's firm position is driven by security concerns and NATO expansion, ladies and gentlemen. Moscow will not concede or accept to pressures that compromise its defense. African leaders watching closely, ladies and gentlemen, see lessons in Russia's approach. Strategic patience, clear goals, and of course readiness to act are key to survival in a complex world, ladies and gentlemen. Putin's promise shows that partnerships are stronger when grounded in mutual trust. Security experts note that Africa's growing ties with Russia could actually reshape global dynamics, ladies and gentlemen. It creates or generates an alternative balance of power. Nations are learning that relying or depending solely on Western support is not always sufficient. Strong alliance, respect for sovereignty, and of course political agreements are essential. Ladies and gentlemen, please, if you actually find this analysis very insightful, please like this video, subscribe to the community, and of course turn on notifications. Staying informed about global events helps us understand how decisions today actually shape tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your wonderful understanding. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, Russia continues to highlight its priorities. Past experiences like broken with an agreement have made Moscow cautious, or very careful but determined. Analysts warn that the conflict in Ukraine could actually last if key issues are ignored. This reinforces the lesson that peace requires careful negotiation and of course attention to security concerns. Africa's response to Putin's message shows foresight. Ladies and gentlemen, leaders are choosing to protect their nations, build capable forces, and of course strengthen international partnerships. These actions reflect responsibility and of course long-term thinking. Looking ahead, Russia-Africa cooperation may expand, in multiple areas, ladies and gentlemen: military, technical, and of course strategic. Putin's announcement signals a new era of partnership. African states can now actually modernize their defense systems, trained personnel, and of course gain access to advanced equipment. Experts say this is not just about weapons, it is about stability. Strong defense and of course reliable partners create safer nations, ladies and gentlemen. Africa's choices demonstrate courage in making dependence decisions even under global pressure. Ukraine remains a challenge for Russia. Motonzi warns that rejecting key security demands may prolong conflict. Crimea and of course Donbass Donbass remains central to negotiations. Moscow insists that lasting peace cannot ignore these realities. Moral lesson. Okay, this is the moral lesson or insight here. True leadership involves responsibility, courage, and of course foresight. Africa's willingness to engage with Russia shows that nations can actually make strategic choices that benefit their people, even when facing complex global pressures. So the world is watching, ladies and gentlemen. The choices made by leaders today will actually affect international relations, peace, and of course security for years. African nations or states are showing that sovereignty or independence and security are non-negotiable values. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. Please like this video if you haven't, subscribe to the channel or the community if you haven't, share and stay informed. Okay, understanding global developments like this empowers us all to see the bigger picture and of course learn from history. Thank you. See you in the next update.